Okay, and just the side arrow.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Jim. I had an unreal experience last night as I was looking for a USB to put my presentation on for Jim for this morning. And it's one which you all probably have because I found this old file from 2007 on it, which I hadn't seen for the best part of 15 years. And it was relating to a campaign I was involved in then for Maynooth University to acquire fair trade status. And in fact, Maynooth University was the first fair trade university in the Republic of Ireland. From there, the next campaign I noticed I was involved in was getting Maynooth Town to become a fair trade town. And yes, Maynooth Town became the first fair trade town in Kildare. And all of this is telling me a little about the way in which Maynooth, as a place with a tradition of outreach, especially to the developing world, has a really important and almost unique place in Irish society, which I think we should recognise. So I was very pleased, therefore, that after those campaigns, I happened to be the president of Taisce, and I was a bit embarrassed that Maynooth University wasn't a green campus at that stage. So together with some of the people that have been mentioned already, I got involved in helping to try and get that status acquired, and delighted when it came. And so it's been a great source of enjoyment to me this morning to see the way in which the campus, the green campus concept and practice has flourished and done so well over the years. And of course, the link between all of that, the link between the developing world, concern for sustainability, concern for tackling the issues of our responsibilities in the developed world and tackling climate change, is what really is behind what I want to talk to you briefly about this afternoon. And of course, the first thing I should say about the IPCC report is it's really unfortunate that it came out at the wrong time. It came out when the news agenda was dominated by other very dramatic and really sad events. And so it didn't get the coverage that perhaps it merited, didn't get the coverage that it certainly deserved as one of the key publications of the last few years, because IPCC reports only come out every 8 years. They're the kind of big bang in climate science. They're the gold standard for the next 7 or 8 years. And this one is no exception to that. Looking at the scale, you can see the number of authors is huge. It has 34,000 citations in the report. But most importantly for me is the number of review comments that were handled in producing that report. I think it's, by my estimates, the second most reviewed publication that has ever been produced in this world, probably after the IPCC Volume 1 report. But 62,000 comments, each of which is handled individually and commented and responded to by the author team, each of which involves both expert science reviewers and also government reviewers. And that's the important partnership of this report, in that it represents the consensus view of 197 governments, including the Irish government. So it's not something you can dismiss lightly. It's not an average climate report that you might get some scant media coverage for. It's something that really represents a very important progression. I don't know if I can go back here. Yeah. Let me try this once more. Maybe it won't move, but nevertheless, it won't. The thing I wanted to start by telling you here is that what the report is telling us is essentially that we're very close now to the guardrails of climate change. This was supposed to be an animation on the right here, which would show the way monthly temperatures have gradually approached that key component, part 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming. And that's the guardrail for the world in terms of climate change. And I'll come back to the reasons for that in a second or two. I'm jumping around here, hoping that the animation will go, but it won't. Not to worry. Anyway, the importance of those guardrails is firstly that it does represent a global average. And therefore, there are parts of the world which are going to warm much more than the rest of the world. So that we know the oceans will be slower, we know the land will be quicker. So when we talk about 1.5 or 2 degrees, we're really talking about places on land where we live, which may be 2, 3, 4 degrees of warming. And that's really something of great concern to us. In terms of the causes, we know, of course, it's the greenhouse gases. We know we in Ireland here, for example, emit about 50% more per capita than the EU average. That's quite a serious responsibility. Each of us in the room here is responsible for about one of those balloons every month in terms of a tonne of CO2, directly and indirectly. And that, again, is saying something to us, because that is something which, if we were to add up, if we were to look at the way in which we could even accumulate one of those balloons for each of us for every day, we would have 160,000 in Ireland building up on every day. If we pile them up at the entrance to the Liffey here, you can see that we can't see the problem, but if we were to able to visualize it that way, we would see just how much of a contribution we make. And the other aspect, of course, is that our contribution is a contribution as a developed country. If you look at the distorted map here, you can see how little of a problem is being caused by the developing world compared to the developed world. You can see the way in which, the culprits are us in the developed world. And if you think the little island offshore there in northwest Europe is insignificant, then we do emit here in Ireland more greenhouse gases than the poorest 400 million people living on the planet. And that gives us quite a responsibility in terms of tackling it. So what is the IPCC telling us? Well, first of all, it's telling us that the warming that we're now experiencing, if we were to take a multi-century period, maybe from 1850 onwards, is something that hasn't been experienced for the past 100 millennia. And that's quite a sobering fact. And also, of course, even if we were to look at the warming of very recent times, it's not something that's been experienced for the past 2 millennia. And we know that that's essentially caused by us. If we were to use models to run without human impact associated with them, then we would be stationary in terms of our temperature curve. It's only when we put in the human effect that we get agreement with what actually has been observed, a damning indictment that for the first time in human history, we are in control of climate. We are not prisoners of climate like our forefathers were. But we know that those warming events are also associated with dramatic changes that will be expected in rainfall in some parts of the world, in places where there are, if you like, a higher dependency on rainfall than here. But I think as a mid-latitude country, we have to ask, well, what will it mean for us in terms of extreme events? And in particular, we can see that we expect to see something close to the global average. So the kind of warming event that maybe we have now once in every 10 years, if we get to 2 or 3 degrees, it's going to be once every 2 years. The kind of extreme event that we might only get once in 50 years is now going to be happening 2 or 3 years out of 5. And that means that society is going to have to adapt. Society is going to have to respond to those events in temperature, just as it will in similar terms to changes in rainfall and changes in rainfall intensity. And that, of course, is something we're already seeing in Ireland, both in terms of intense rainfall and flood events, but increasingly, as work in this university is showing in Icarus, a really growing awareness of the importance of droughts. Now, why is all this important? It's important because we now know that that range that I mentioned, those guardrails of 1.5 to 2 degrees, represents places where we may be starting things to happen climatically, which we may not be able to recover from. We know that we may have started the loss, irrevocable loss, of the coral reefs, the irrevocable loss of the alpine glaciers, even the melting out of Greenland may be underway at the moment. And those are quite serious events which will be minor compared to other more serious events that might occur at higher levels. So we're getting to the point, if you like, where really serious action is going to be required. And that's what the IPCC Volume 2 report is talking about last week. It's talking about changes in risk in terms of heat and water, changes in food security, and in terms of flood. Those are the kind of things that I think we're going to have to tackle. But for me, one of the great things about that report was the kind of conclusion that said we're really going to have to work with nature much more, that nature has many of the solutions, that if we destroy those, we're going to face even higher risks in many key areas. And we've touched on some of those already this morning. the issues of pollination, the issues of food, the issues of health, for example. Those are the things that are going to increasingly come to the fore and are now being recognised by the UN report. Just to mention biodiversity, the report is quite alarming in that in many respects. Here you can see the loss of biodiversity it suggests for a warming level of 3 degrees on land. And you can see there are parts of the world where you're looking at losses of over 50% of biodiversity. They are life support systems which we can ill afford to lose. I wanted to show you one output from a modelling paper because it is, to me, quite a serious indictment of what will happen in some of the hotter parts of the world. The reds and the blues you can see for the Arabian Peninsula here are places where if we continue as business as usual, we're looking at mean daily maximum temperatures of over 55 degrees centigrade on an average. In some places we're looking at, for the purples here, around 60 degrees centigrade on an average. And that's really unlivable. You can't work outside. You can't do very much outside. Those places are going to become extremely unsustainable in the future, with all sorts of consequences if you think about it for migration. And we in Ireland, of course, as a mid-latitude country, are now following quite closely the global average, which is what you would expect. Maybe the ocean will protect us a little more for a few years, but nevertheless, that's where we're going. And if we take the modelling that we've been doing in Maynooth over the years, we know that we're going to get a continuation of the warming we've seen in our climate here in Ireland over the next few years, even the next 30 years, of another ½ degree to 1 degree. And we're going to see perhaps the real crunch for Ireland, which will be increased rainfall, especially in winter, and decreased rainfall, especially in summer in the east, where of course people and agriculture will be in competition for a dwindling supply of water. And we've seen some of those events. Wetter winters. We had the wettest winter on record over half of Ireland about 7 years ago. We've had the stormiest winter for 143 years about 8-9 years ago. And that was work that was done in this university by my colleagues in Icarus as well. But all of this has consequences for Ireland in terms of habitats, in terms of biodiversity. You can imagine what dry summers will be like for bogs, or what sea level will do to salt marshes, or what warming temperatures will do to species trying to move to higher and higher levels in our mountains. All of this has to be factored in, and of course we will lose species. We now have about 160 breeding pairs of curlews left in Ireland, something which is, if you like, a psychological resource for many older Irish people going to the bog, hearing the curlew. That's going to be a thing of the past, just like the corncrake. Arctic char are not going to like warmer waters in our uplands. Even salmon are not going to like warmer waters offshore. All of this is saying, if you like, that we have a problem that Green Campus is attempting to address in its own small way. And this is the kind of donut approach which is now becoming quite popular in terms of defining, if you like, a safe living space for humanity, founded by social principles, but with an ecological ceiling. And that ecological ceiling is effectively the limitation of what we can do with our planet. And we know that that is being breached in some key areas like climate change, areas like biodiversity loss, land conversion, and especially nitrogen and phosphorus inputs to our soils. The problem, of course, is that we have a limited time to tackle that. And this is the sad bit of the story, because we know that if we want to avoid 1.5 degrees warming with, say, a 50-50 chance, we've got a decade or less to do that in. We've less than a decade now. If we want to avoid 2 degrees, we have maybe 2 decades, 3 decades at the most to avoid that. So the time, if you like, for action is now. And that's why, it's so important that we get the policies in position to actually address this in a meaningful way. This is our current commitment in Ireland to a 51% reduction. We're offering 4.8% over the next 5 years. Many people would say that's simply not enough, and even then unlikely to be realised. So Green Campus is a network, and it's a network which is attempting, if you like, to tackle these twin problems of concern for the developing world, but also concern for tackling the necessary emission reductions through mitigation and adaptation to tackle climate change. If you thought Joe Larragy's organogram was complicated, I know many of you did, this is equally complicated, but what it's saying is really the idea that Patricia was talking about, the idea that Michael was talking about, that only by a community approach, only by getting together and tackling this problem in a coherent way, which overcomes short-term vested interest groups, which overcomes the need to, if you like, think only of the next 5 years, but really educates the young people of today who we require to inherit this philosophy, who we require to take on the burden of tackling climate change that we, as an older generation, are unfortunately passing on to them. So that's why Green Campus matters. That's why Green Campus has a logic, and that's why Green Campus requires all our support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, any questions for John? I know we're very tight for time. I think Galen is holding up. So, well, look, I just want to thanks, John. Thank you all for coming today. I have nothing else to add after John's talk. So it starts off. It is quite a depressing, situation we're in. The world is in, but there is hope, and there's hope if we band together as a community. The Maynooth Green Campus is trying to tackle a lot of these issues, and again, if we do small things, they'll all add up. So we can't lose hope. So that's where I want to leave it today. I want to thank you for your attendance today. For those of you who are going to join us on the walk, I think we're convening down outside the library, so let's go and get that done. Thank you very much.